Okay. We are ready to go then. Oh, it's already recording. So welcome everyone to the Department of Medicine Equity and Inclusion Summer Series. This is our third year in a row hosting this event. And today we are very, very excited to have Dr. Lamba, a friend and colleague, present on activating inclusive leadership. It is such a pleasure to have you with us today. So Dr. Lamba serves as Vice President for Faculty Development at Rutgers University and as the inaugural Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion with Rutgers Biomedical and Health Sciences. She's a professor of emergency medicine. Her role is to champion, lead, and implement a fully integrated strategy for diversity, equity, and inclusion, including health equity initiatives at RBHS. And Gita, the floor is yours. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Silk, and it's wonderful to be with all of you on this wonderful morning. And Silk and I have done a lot of work together. So last 3 meetings we've spoken together. So it's a pleasure to see you on screen again, Silk.
Yes.
So I'm going to get started. We'll be talking about activating your inclusive leadership as a topic of today. And just a quick roadmap. I'll start out with talking about some of the grounding assumptions and shared definitions, so we're all on the same page as I discuss a couple of things. The second is discussing leadership in a complex and changing world. We'll talk about some of the competencies that people list as being useful for inclusive leadership, some steps that inclusive leaders take effectively, and if time permits, we can talk a little bit about a roadmap on how to get there. So one of the first things that I often start by saying is there is no expert in diversity-related education. So I do want to share that. There's just a commitment to making sure that we're learning and building our habits. So you'll see as I speak, I will refer to the work of many others who have come and spoken on this topic. Spoke on this topic before me. The second thing that I want to share is that this work is applicable to all. Often when we talk about leadership, we think, oh, it's for the chair of the department, it's for the chief of a division, but this is really truly work that is relevant to everyone, regardless of rank or level or roles, or whether you're a trainee or whether you are, in fact, faculty or a leader. The reason being that we are all leaders within our own spheres of influence. So I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about a couple of the concepts that I'm going to share. And then lastly, we should have some shared understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I wanted to at least talk about the frame that I use, just so when I'm speaking about these terms, you have an idea of what I'm referring to. So the first common shared understanding is that diversity and inclusion must be intertwined and very closely linked if you are to aim for success and for organizational transformation. And simply the diversity is the who, considering diversity in all of its different dimensions, and inclusion is the how. And how do we make sure this is the active process of doing or creating those environments where people have space and a seat at the table. Notice very deliberately, I didn't say voice or influence on the table. I just said space. The concepts of equity and are the ones that ensure that voices are valued. I'll talk a little bit more about equity as we move along. So why are we talking about leadership and leadership of the future? It is, in essence, a different mindset. So one thing that COVID has taught us in this past couple of years is change is inevitable and it is a volatile world. And rapid change has become the norm, at least for us, for the last couple of years. So the leaders who are emerging for the future will also need to have an agile and nimble sort of different mindset. Just to highlight a couple of things to think about as you think about leaders of the future: diversity of markets, rural versus urban, what will be an emerging growth area for healthcare. These are all things in the horizon that are fuzzy and may become clearer with time. Our customers, everyone expects better personalization of products and services. Amazon has done that to us, and the retail industry is going through this right now. And it's not surprising for us to take a step back and say, well, what will our practices look like in the future? So the leaders of the future have to have that mindset of the vision for the future. The third part is the diversity of ideas. And, you may have often heard successful leaders never waste a crisis. And think about COVID-19 2 years ago. Overnight, literally overnight, we went from hardly any virtual medicine to being 100% virtual. And all of a sudden it became okay to attend meetings on Zoom and not waste hours, going up and down the turnpike for me from campus to campus. All of a sudden it became okay for students and residents to listen to podcasts and lectures, wearing pajamas at home. And it was okay for them not to be live in class. We had to have a major disruption in the form of COVID for that to happen. It's not that, our trainees or our patients weren't demanding that before. It's that we needed a crisis for that to make it happen. And then the last part I'd like to think about as we think about the leaders of the future is the generational sort of attitudes that, those of us who are over the age of 50 often talk about, and the diversity of talent. So how do we harness this very strong advocacy and social justice-based spirit of our millennial learners? How do we understand what the needs are for and attitudes are towards work-life balance? And then again, all of this being very important to us as leaders in the upcoming years. I did say that I wanted to highlight equity within the diversity, equity, and inclusion space as a shared understanding. So equity-mindedness individuals are truly aware of some of the social historical contexts and the impacts that exclusion or power asymmetries have on different individuals, on opportunities and outcomes, particularly for our Black and Brown communities. So the questions change when you use the equity-minded lens, and leaders of the future will have to have some aspect of this equity-minded lens in their mind. So just a couple of questions to get you thinking about what that equity-mindedness looks like. So if diversity asks who is in the room, the equity lens asks who is trying to get into the room and cannot, or asks the question, whose presence in the room is actually under constant threat of being erased. So just a different shift in the lens. So if inclusion asks, has everyone's idea been heard? Equity actually asks the question, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they're not in the majority. So I just wanted to put that in sort of that foundational space as I now shift gears towards talking about leadership. And with that, I think one of the things that I often like to ask ourselves is, why are we in academia? And often what I hear people say is, well, we're here for academic excellence. And that's great. And it's been proven over and over again that academic excellence pathway is through inclusive excellence. So, okay, then what does that look like for every individual? And how do leaders actually go ahead and work towards this? You may have seen multiple examples of leadership approaches. Often, when you're writing your personal statements, people ask you to describe your leadership approach. And you may have picked collaborative, or you may have picked democratic, hopefully not autocratic. As you hear me speak about the inclusive leadership, you'll notice that that concept borrows heavily from some of these prior concepts, both amplifying some of them and then merging them to create a unique sort of subset. So in particular, the servant leadership model, the democratic leadership model, the collaborative and transformative model are often what is used to describe the new emerging conversation on inclusive leadership. And the first point that inclusive leadership talks about is the fact that it is not about the leader. It really is not about the leader, it's about the people. So more and more you'll hear me emphasize that in our conversation. The second thing that I want to frame is we within healthcare are given tons of training to do our jobs well. And what happens when we do them well is we're transitioned to leadership roles. And then we have to manage people who are doing what we actually did well. But the preparation or thought process to how to manage people, how to think about our style of leadership, our approaches to leadership, that's often left for us to figure out. It's no different than teaching. So, you taught your discipline-specific work, but teaching is expected to come naturally. So no surprise that most of us learned our leadership skills by trial and error in many, many ways. So as we think about the old leadership IQ, it was about how smart you are. As you think about the new leadership IQ, it's about how smart you make others or how smart you make your team. So you will see a lot of definitions of inclusive leadership. The definition I like to use is by Francis Fry and Ann Morris, and they describe that in their book, Unleashed, The Unapologetic Leader's Guide to Empowering Everyone Around You. And I really like this definition because it talks about leadership as about making others better as a result of our presence. But in fact, the empowering goes beyond and having that impact last even into our absence. So truly, it's not about being in charge, but taking care of those who are placed in our charge. And that shift frame that Francis Fry and Ann Morris talk about is what I really like about this definition of inclusive leadership. How much better are you making it for others? And in fact, the business world is always ahead in this conversation. And Microsoft actually uses this query as a performance metric for their leaders. So I'm not sure if we'll be able to do this in the chat, but I'd be curious to hear if you think about a time when you observed someone leading in an inclusive manner, and you think about a couple of behaviors that they engaged in, or qualities that you believe would make for what you think in your mind would be an inclusive leader. And Silk, I don't know, yes. I may not be able to see the chat, but if...
Yes, unfortunately for the webinars, the chat is deactivated, but if individuals want to include it in the Q&A or simply reflect on this, they can certainly do that.
So I'll give people a moment to think about that. And if someone posts it in the Q&A, Silk, if you can call that out for me, that would be great.
I don't see any at this time. Oh, here's one. Dr. Kara states, making a point of making sure that everyone at the table has a chance to speak. That made a difference.
Speaking up. allowing others to speak up is a great trait of inclusive leaders.
Dr. Over says, excellent listener.
Listening and actively listening, amazing trait that often inclusive leaders show.
Haas tells us they advocate for others who might not feel they have a voice.
Awesome. Advocacy, that equity-minded lens and speaking up for those who are in your charge.
Dr. Tran says, I've worked with leaders who go around the table to give the quiet members a chance to chime in.
Again, that's speaking up, allowing for the safety for people to voice their opinions. So absolutely. And I'm sure if I gave enough time to people, they would have 50 other things that they could list in what they think about when they see that image of an inclusive leader. So I'll move on. And like I said, many models exist, many frameworks exist. The one that I'm listing today here is from Deloitte. And again, the business world, the consultant world has really given it a lot of thought. Interviewed, in fact, over 1,500 employees, looked at literature. And these are the 6, what they call signature traits that emerged. And I'll try and go through each one of them quickly, but you notice that within this frame, I've added a few words. So for commitment, I've added visible commitment. For courage and cultural intelligence, the fact that humility and empathy are really important. Collaboration, being aware of your own biases. These are all features that the traits that inclusive leaders often demonstrate. The one that's not in this model, which I think has emerged as an important one, is also I'd like to consider resiliency and agility and adaptability to the change in circumstances is often another one to highlight. So as we think about this, let's highlight a couple of the ones in this model. So the visible commitment piece. This is you believe in and you have the ability to make the argument for inclusion and equity and actually also be able to describe why it's important for your organization and team. The one part that I would highlight here is that it's not enough to say, I am committed. People who work with you need to know that this commitment is somewhat grounded in experiences to make it meaningful and have that visible part that's really clearly important. People actually connect to stories. So as you think about yourself as an inclusive leader within the visible commitment space, try to think about developing your personal why. Many of you, if you apply for jobs, will be asked to write for a contribution to diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. And we can have a whole conversation on what makes for a great statement like that. But remember, this is more about spending a little bit of time to figuring out why is this important to you? And I offer a couple of questions here to sort of help that journey is, when did these issues become most salient for you? When did you realize that the privilege and advantage that you have for others is different? And what have you done to act towards making sure that you do something about it? Or when did you first feel like you were an outsider and what did you learn from that process? But vision for why you are a change agent and that personal why is often important when you're going on your inclusive leadership journey in many ways. The other traits that you saw listed were courage and cognizance or bias of your own biases. So at the core of both these traits is a humility or an understanding that, I may not know it all. And if you notice, there's an internal facing component and an external facing component to this. So you should be, inclusive leaders often have the ability to shine a mirror to themselves and are able to accept feedback, but then they also have the courage to challenge a practice that may not be fair or equity-based. So, and then the leap that they make is that they not only recognize it in themselves, but in structures around them, and then they act. And again, I'm going to emphasize on the acting portion. So one example that I can highlight is residency and faculty interviews. So within your groups, how do you address affinity bias? And this is that bias that you tend to favor sameness, or those who, you may feel the connection or feel the other word for exclusion, which is, you feel like you fit here. How do you actively mitigate against that? And how do you actively mitigate against the halo effect? And we certainly as a state university see that. If you're from Harvard and UPenn, you're automatically assumed to be superior than, better than. And these are biases that you have to be very active and intentional to prevent from emerging and impacting decisions all around you. Those truly committed inclusive leaders that I have had the pleasure to work with really have intentionality that exists for them in each and every decision. So who you're inviting for a lecture, if you are doing buyout of time for education, for example, for doing small groups in the medical school, who are those people? Who are you nominating for your awards? Who's on the committee that's selecting people for these awards? So that intentionality is at the core of this courage and cognizance sort of signature traits for inclusive leaders. And remembering that most of our biases and shortcuts emerge when we're busy, and God knows all of us are busy and constantly busy. So this hypervigilance really has to be taking a step back occasionally. And even if it's transient, just taking that one moment to say, am I making some assumptions here? What am I missing? Are things to consider when we talk about those. Curiosity and open-mindedness and that growth-minded mindset is really an important one. And of course, with curiosity comes the fact that you are non-judgmental. And you heard a lot when we were having conversations about leadership, about it shifted from IQ to EQ. And now the concept is emerging of great leaders have high CQ, which is the cultural intelligence. And again, many components that sort of emerge from the other, the emotional, higher marks in the emotional EQ. And again, that ability to read verbal and behavioral cues, recognize that somebody else is the expert in their own culture, and that humility comes into play. So recognizing that the signature traits of a high CQ are part of inclusive leadership as well. So if I were to summarize what we just spoke about, it would be that inclusive leaders actually see the world in 3 dimensions. So the 3D vision they have is of themselves, their own biases, other individuals, and I'll focus a little bit on this intent versus impact because it's an important concept. And then the culture that they're creating around them. They're creating those low-risk environments where differences can be expressed, as was said even in the chat, when your vision of inclusive leadership was the speak up culture. And understanding that if you're aiming for agreement from everyone, then perhaps consider that inclusion is a real problem. When you think about other individuals, so I talked about self, I talked about culture, and in the middle are individuals. This is that focus that shifts from intent. If someone is telling you a story about what happened to them, and you automatically start having a narrative about Well, the person may not have meant that. You're focusing on intent. If you can shift your focus from the intent, because it doesn't matter we're not in a legal world. Intent, we don't have to prove intent. What does matter is the impact on the individual. So inclusive leaders really do this well. And active listening came up in the traits that was listed in the chat. This is the ability to listen to understand as opposed to listen to respond and react. This is very hard for us as physicians because we are trained to respond and react. So to sit back and listen is actually a skill set or a muscle you have to develop. So understanding that the impact is always the right focus, the intent, you just assume good intent. Most people usually don't intentionally go out to say hurtful things or to be harming others. So moving on, the last trait that I wanted to highlight was collaboration. And here, really, it's talking about two aspects to collaboration. You need to have sort of a psychological safety. And if you're truly moving the dial of inclusion, and I'll talk about both of these concepts very briefly here, each one of these can be a conversation for an hour in and of itself. So what do I mean by psychological safety? Again, the definition here comes from the work that Amy Edmondson has done in her book, The Fearless Organizations, and I'll just read that out. So the psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, and most importantly, concerns or mistakes. So again, some of these emerged earlier, and these are, again, leading by example, owning up to mistakes, that vulnerability that you show that I'm not perfect and it's okay not to be perfect. And how do we move on from it? We again talked about listening actively and some of the speaking up culture. So, and it's interesting, if majority of the people believe that they have an open mindset, and if you think, or that you have an open door policy, and this really came to a head for us recently, because we had an incident where there was an individual in a very high power position that was let go. Very powerful, tons of money in the institution. Turns out that the business manager had been uncomfortable and knew that these decisions that were being made were suspect. And that person resigned and took another job. We only found out, at the time of the exit interview. And the reason that the person gave is, I was afraid of losing my job and I was afraid of retaliation. I wanted a reference letter. So now we have to take shine that mirror on ourselves and say, what was it about our culture that made this person so afraid to speak up? And there are examples after examples after examples of this in academia. The USC Dean case in California, many of you may know that the culture of not being empowered to speak up also came up there. So remember, creating this fearless environment, leaders have to lead by example, and it's easier said than done. That open door policy may not necessarily be an open door policy. One of the questions that has been spoken of in literature that you can ask those who are near and dear to you or around you, to ask the question, what is the perceived risk of respectfully disagreeing with me publicly? And if someone can give you an honest answer, you will sort of have a gauge of whether you truly have or are building an inclusive culture in your space or environment. I spoke very briefly about the inclusion dial. So often people just talk about inclusion as being inclusive, right? This is again, Francis Fry and Ann Morris's work, where they say, actually, it's a dial that you're moving up. You go from being safe, physically and emotionally safe in any gathering, this is the lowest level. You feel welcome for being there, regardless of your difference. But the magic really happens when you're celebrated. And that is, you're celebrated for the difference that you bring to the table, and that your uniqueness is the value that you add. And then true inclusive leaders are able to make the leap to the dial of being cherished, which means not only is an individual feeling that they themselves are celebrated, but they're seeing others being valued and celebrated for their difference. And that is, of course, the peak of what the dial of inclusion would look like. The one thing I have not mentioned so far, which often comes up when you talk about leadership, is trust. And you know that culture change happens at the speed of trust. And I would encourage all of you to listen to this podcast by Valerie Ashby, who does a really good job of describing how we did not get here overnight, and we will not get out of this overnight. And she talks about this whole concept of trust. And I just wanted to highlight one important piece. Again, I heavily borrow from Francis Fry's work here, is that trust is an easy and actually a really difficult concept if you have to describe how do you build trust. And the reason is that it's a feeling. It's a sense that, they have my back and I have their back. And the organization that usually comes to my mind when I hear about this intense feeling of trust is actually the military. And a couple of examples, there's a tech company in New York City that has said that once we employ you, we will not fire you. It's our job to make sure that you succeed. And that level of trust opens people up to say things or do things, innovate, in ways that our cultures may not be to the level of. So recognize that this trust is rather a simple and a difficult concept. Turns out that to build trust, 3 components are necessary within inclusive leadership. First is integrity, and the integrity is what you say and what you do match. So there are no hidden messages. The second is logic. And here you can be quite rigorous, but if you're transparent and fair and have high expectations, people will have the faith in you that you mean well. And then again, that empathy piece comes up here in trust as well, being concerned about the human, just not their output. And that really requires listening to and understanding the person behind the job, which is very, very difficult to do when the world is catered to building RVUs and dollars earned as the metric of success. So I've talked a lot about what it takes. I should probably spend a couple of minutes to talk about common derailers. And you know that off-ramps and exits are plenty on this path. I'll highlight a few here. Fear of making a mistake or guilt after you make a mistake is often a paralyzer of action. And I'm sure each one of us can recall a circumstance where we actually may have used a wrong word, or we may have not spoken up when we should have, or seen someone being treated unfairly. Or we may just feel like we could have done more to address an inequity that we were aware of. And for some of us, what happens is that we get called out when we make such an error. And the emotions that this triggers, whether it's fear, whether it's shame, whether it's guilt, are very paralyzing. And they often lead to inaction. So inclusive leaders often have the ability to get past these emotions. One, they're able to live in discomfort and be okay with that. And the second, so a couple of strategies to consider here are taking a moment to reflect, where are these emotions really coming from? What is it about that critique or challenge that is creating these really powerful emotions for you? And if you're being challenged or critiqued, considering particularly switching the lens to say, I'm just being simply asked to consider the impact of that word or action. So it's okay, again, to shift that meaning from intent to impact. The other part is often, I spoke about this, invalidating another's perspective. Often when people are telling uncomfortable stories or their lived experiences, we automatically jump to seeking an alternate explanation. It's happened when I present data on faculty, for example. Many times people will focus on the unknowns. Oh, we have 20% people who didn't self-declare, so we really don't know what the data is showing us. That alternate explanation is actually taking away from the narrative that is being shown. So recognize why are people doing that, and taking, recognize that you're actually shifting the lens from what the topic is. So perhaps we're doing that so we feel comfortable. So when you have that tendency to share your own experiences when someone else is sharing theirs, think about a couple of questions. Who is this really for? Am I using my story to tell someone how they should feel? Or am I feeling so uncomfortable that I feel like I need to change the conversation? And here again, I can't emphasize those active listeners who don't need to change the narrative are truly perceived as being inclusive. Of course, the emphasis on equality versus equity, I do want to spend 1 second talking about that. A lot of the leaders I see within my organization, and perhaps yours is a little different, they use the words equality and equity interchangeably. And understanding the difference, I think, is key if your focus is going to be equity-minded. So the equality frame, in essence, is saying everyone should have similar access to resources to be successful. And that's great, because what you're seeking is truly fairness. And the trouble with that is you're making the assumption that everyone is starting from the same point. Everyone had the same level of support. Everyone's at the level playing field concept. Equity, on the other hand, is emphasizing that everyone needs resources that they need to be successful. So that means everyone may not need the exactly same things. So the equity frame is really saying that the playing field may not really be level, and to make it so requires some thoughtful consideration to watch what each person is needing so that they have the same opportunity to succeed. And again, I cannot overemphasize this, because a lot of times these words are used interchangeably. And as you move your dial and activate your inclusive leadership, having an understanding of that has been very useful for me. So I hope it's useful for you as well. Silk, I think I have ample time, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Robert Livingston's work, if that's okay. Great. So if you have not read Robert Livingston's work on the conversation, I would highly encourage you to spend a few minutes reading that book. And he really talks a lot about, okay, we understand what diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice are. We understand what traits and what behaviors we need to exhibit as inclusive leaders. But now is that action part. How do we take action, and what is that roadmap for us to move the dial on a lot of these issues? And he frames this concept in the condition, concern, correction framework. So really, first it starts with, do I understand what the problem is and where it's coming from? So here, as leaders, just thinking about, and you've heard people say these statements, we don't have any discriminatory practices or policies in our department, or we don't have any discrimination that exists in our school. Again, we treat everyone fairly and equally. Again, my feeling about equally versus equitably. This may actually cover up the issues that may exist. So if you don't even understand what the problem is and where it's coming from, you really cannot do anything about it. Here again, there's that understanding that, it's not just a few bad apples, or, you may do one training and a couple trainings are going to fix the problem. It's also that understanding that, blaming things that are out of our control are not going to get movement. And here, the classic one that I often hear within my world is, oh, it's a pipeline problem. We just don't have enough. And that's why we can't do better and do better in many ways. It's also the idea of not only focusing on, if you were to think about our environment as a stream, which is the analogy that Robert Livingston uses, it's not only being mindful of the individuals or the fish in the stream, but also being very conscious of the structural dynamics or the currents that permeate it, and how those currents make it easier for some individuals to move further, but may hinder the path of some of the individuals. So understanding what the problem is and where it comes from really is using those skills that we just talked about, that inclusive leaders demonstrate so well, with the active listening and being growth-minded and open-minded and having a speak-up culture. That helps you get to that point. The second is you have to be concerned. You may know what the problem is, but you have to care enough about the problem and the people that it harms to really move the dial on taking action. And empathy, exposure is probably the one pathway. Listening is the other pathway to build empathy. And only then can you sort of move the dial in the roadmap of taking action as an inclusive leader to correct the problem. And here, the part that I want to emphasize is that this has to be a strategy not on just one front, but in that three-dimensional front. So you're also thinking about individual personal attitudes, you're thinking about the informal culture, and you're thinking about the formal policies that exist within your space. And as you know, if you were to use the analogy of weight loss, enough strategies exist for us to succeed, but it requires a lot of patience and a lot of determination and a lot of resources and a lot of reinforcement to make sure that the changes that we really hope to transform, those changes stick. I started my dialogue talking about inclusive leadership and the fact that it's not about being in charge, but taking care of those who are in your charge. And as you do that, you cannot do that alone, and it is people that you have to bring along on your journey. And as you think about folks in your organizations or in your spaces, how do you bring others along on your leadership journey? Again, Robert Livingston, whose work I have framed here, talks about three sorts of individuals. So the ostriches, who are truly, either just not concerned because they may not understand, or it's not relevant. The information is not relevant to them. The dolphins, who are very pro-social, really mean well, are really community-based, want to do good. And then the sharks, who are just vehemently opposed to any movement of the dial that you hope to or want to make. And within these spaces, I'd be curious to see if folks could tell me, how many sharks do you think exist within organizations? What percentage, if 100%, is the team structure? Any thoughts? How many sharks? We focus on sharks all the time.
I see somebody guessing 40%.
40% sharks. Oh my, that's a dangerous place to live in.
20%.
If the price was right, you would be closer.
Another one is guessing 10%, but they make enough noise for a far higher percentage.
And that's the point. So the point is, most people, when you're trying to move the dial for doing more work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, you forget that it's about 10 to 12% are the sharks, but they make so much noise and they're such a big threat that they take on the personality or the focus of many of us who know that this is going to be the hardest cohort to bring along the journey. Turns out that the largest cohort is actually the pro-socials who care about, worry about, and they're close to about 49%. And there's about 38, 39% ostriches amongst us. The reason I bring this up, and the reason that Robert Livingston really talks about this, is as each one of us seek to do the work, the tools that you use for these cohorts to bring them along, or these individuals, vary. So for the pro-socials, they just need a couple extra tools and they can go out and be better angels. And these are the ones that you really want to focus on, because they're the ones who want to do the work, who will take on and be champions. And honestly, in our settings, the students and the residents in diversity, equity, racial equity work have been the champions. And to us, they have been actually the leaders and the inclusive leaders in this space. For the apathetic or the uninformed, again, carrots may help. You want to make them, for the ostriches, you sort of need, maybe there's more data, some relevance, maybe some carrots that make it relevant to the ostriches to pay attention. And then I will leave the sharks alone, but perhaps a few sticks, maybe the way that it goes with the sharks. So having discussed how to get there and the roadmap, the last part that I want to highlight, and this may be my last slide, Selk, is how do you know success, and what will that look like? And again, I just want to make sure that I highlight two things here, because often in most departments and institutions, we tend to focus on achievement. Again, we are very, very metric centered. So we'll look at demographics. If you're looking at demographics, look at function and level. If you look at our demographics, for example, for faculty, we have 51% by gender. We have 51% women and 49% men in Rutgers Biomedical Health Sciences, and that's about 2,000 faculty. Looks great. If we look at where our women faculty are centered, they're all junior. So the 70% of our lecturers and instructors are women faculty, whereas 30% are men. If you look at the professors, that ratio is flipped. About 69% are men. So if you don't look at achievement by level or demographics by level, and just sort of parse out data, you may lose it in the big picture. And the second part of the scorecard that's important is sentiment. And remember, the feelings matter in this work. How do we treat our staff? How do we treat our students, our residents, everyone? How do they perceive they are being treated? How do we face our structural hurdles? Are we just leaving with the status quo? It's a pipeline problem. I can't do anything better. Or are you trying to create those new ways? And then, is responsibility and commitment happening within your department, within your organization, both at a personal level and at an institutional level? Is the community beginning to care for each other? And again, the last part I cannot overemphasize. If within leadership, what you say, what you commit to, and what you actually do are all sort of aligned. So in summary, embrace difference as a source of your strategic strength. Create environments where others excel. You don't need to wait till you have a leadership title to start. You can start now and run within your sphere of control. And with that, I will stop sharing. And I can't believe I was on time.
Well, this was wonderful. It was on time, and the topic is timely. So all those things. I would like to invite everyone, if you have any questions, to post those, and we'll ask them live with the time that remains. I do have a few comments, but let me see here really quickly, see if somebody posted. Okay, so somebody in the audience is asking, from your perspective, what might be the best way to get everyone on board with DEI-related initiatives? Should it be based on business case, data-driven, or personal narrative?
So I will share, as I hinted, data does not drive conversation. Stories are much more powerful. I mean, I started my journey in the gender equity space and then moved on into doing more broader diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And one of the things that's clear is when you present data, what you say and what people perceive are very different things. Like I said, when I present data on faculty and share that we didn't hire any tenure track professors who were either self-identifying as African-American or Hispanic as ethnicity within the last 2 years, people will say, well, but 30% didn't self-declare. That's where they are. So data is hard. Personal narratives really move the dial. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of allies. It is not the few of us who are living in the echo chambers who are going to make the difference. It's those who are the allies. And I truly believe the advocacy and the social-minded spirit of our residents and our students is what's going to drive change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that comment. That answer. I do have a comment, and I wonder what your take is. So the Department of Medicine actually hosts this professional development called Strategic Equity and Leadership. An inclusion leadership program. And we will actually, I posted some information in the chat for our next session starting this fall. And we do discuss Livingston's work, specifically those 5 stages to promote equity in the workplace. And the thing that I usually spend most time discussing with individuals that are participating in the course is that problem awareness, right? Where indeed many of our leaders may recognize that indeed there are issues in society in general, right, around this topic of racism, but fail to recognize how we are complicit in our own organizations, right, of perpetuating this. So I was just wondering, when it comes to problem awareness for individual leaders in your experience, how have you gotten past that notion that, we can't see what we're being complicit to in our decision process, in our own organizations, how we're treating each other, et cetera. Does that make sense, Geeta?
I am pretty amazed that you think that we've moved the dial.
I'm just trying. I'm the eternal optimist, as you know.
Yes, it's a journey. And I will tell you that, we struggle with the same things that you struggle with, which is I almost hope that leaders would join in on some of the faculty conversations and the resident conversations that we have, because you'll hear a very different story there. And more faculty, and because we're in much more open, honest dialogue, which sometimes the upper echelons of leadership may not be listening to. I'll just say that it's constant sort of reminders and using that opportunity with the allies, so you're not the only person speaking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, has been really important. So cultivating those allies. So we have one of the centers where the center director has influence, and he has really been moving the dial in his own space. So really, every time he does something, I amplify it, he amplifies it, people pay attention. The other thing which has really come to be of help for us is President Holloway, our first Black president at Rutgers, has really made diversity, equity, and inclusion a sort of mission area for him. And that has filtered down to the chancellor. That has filtered down from the chancellor to the deans. That has filtered down from the deans to the chairs. So it really has to be top down and bottom up, both. But it's a dial. I don't, that's the one that we're still working on.
I have one more,
Yeah.
and then we'll thank everyone for joining us. But one of the discussions that also happens is that how this perception that inclusive efforts are more of a threat to majority career opportunities, whatever the majority group is in the organization. How may you counter some of those arguments that may not present so clear as feeling self-conscious about a threat, but they actually come out in a very obscure way? They're really thinking that this might be a threat to career opportunities that they may have if they allow others to be a part of that.
Yeah, I think the way to think about that is, one, when you, the analogy again, Silk, you've heard this, is a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So if you have programs and practices in place that are equity minded, that are fair minded, and you're creating, for example, the ramps for a building where someone with a wheelchair can have access. You're not just creating that for the person who has that need, but next time you're going on a trip and you have your roller bag, you're going to appreciate that ramp. So you really are doing it for everybody. But the other part to remember is to be very mindful of what you said when you're moving that inclusion dial, and you're making it sort of moving the dial for some, that you make a very clear intent that you're careful not to move any individual or group down the dial. So you really have to make sure that it truly is lifting all, as opposed to one versus the other. And that piece of that zero-sum game, that if someone gets lifted and I'm left behind, is something that you have to combat and communicate, I guess. I don't know if that answered your question, but
no, it does. It does. I want to thank you for participating in our third annual EDI Summer Series and being the first speaker of the summer. I want to encourage everyone to complete the evaluation. For those of you that are interested in the Strategic Equity and Inclusion Leadership Program, the information is in the chat. I also invite you to read a lot of the literature and papers by Dr. Lamba, which really address several dimensions around diversity. Geeta, thank you for your time today.
The tech gods were kind to us. Thank you, everyone.
At 8:59, it worked out, and definitely the webinar function was better than the one we used in the past.
Awesome. It was a pleasure to spend my morning with you. Thank you for listening in, and
yes,
take care.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye now.
Oh, and stay tuned for the July session with Dr. Sasha Sharp. Okay, bye.